Hello, my name is Stacy Wright, and I have chosen for my topic racial inequity in special education. I chose this topic because one, I'm a special education teacher, and number two, there seems to be a lot of disproportionality within the African American community. I chose two journal articles from the Exceptional Children's Journal, which I found by Googling and going onto their website. The first article is titled Justifying and Explaining Disproportionality. The second one is Achieving Equity in Special Education. I also chose one report from the Education Appalachia Regional Comprehensive Center, which was titled Equity in Special Education. The disproportionate representation of ethnic and language minority students is among the most critical and enduring problems in the field of special education and has raised significant civil rights and educational concerns. In this presentation, I will cover three topic areas. First, we'll talk about the historical context for current problems of racial ethnic disparity. Then we'll talk about the possible causes and conditions that create or maintain disproportionality. And then finally, we'll talk about interventions. First, I want to go over some key vocabulary words. Disproportionality is defined as the overrepresentation of a particular group of people in a particular group or system. This representation will either exceed our expectations for that group or differ substantially from the representation of others in that category. Disparity is defined as the unequal or inequitable treatment of one group as compared to another. A little history about special education. Special education emerged out of the struggles of the civil rights movement with legislative actions such as Brown versus the Board of Education, an attempt to provide equal access to education for all students. Although the case was about racial inequity in the American school system, it had far-reaching consequential effects as many began to view the civil rights movement as more than just a black and white issue, but that of race, class, gender, and access. These civil rights efforts resulted in the first national special education legislation. As early as the 1960s, leaders in the field of special education began to document racially based disparities in service, most notably with African American students. Civil rights in education. Education is not just a human right, but equitable or equal education is also a human right. Possible causes. Although experts have varying opinions as to the causes of disproportionality, they understand the critical need for further research into the contributing mechanisms that lead to racial and ethnic disparities in special education. Experts do agree that the overuse of more restrictive placements, especially for African American students with disabilities, is likely due to factors other than the severity of the disability. These factors that contribute to disproportionality are test bias, poverty, special education processes, inequity in general education, issues of behavior management, and cultural differences. And there are other things that contribute to disproportionality, but these are the things that we'll be covering in this presentation. First, let's start with test bias. A number of possible conditions or causes related to special education disproportionality have been explored, beginning in the 1970s with test bias. Literature that explores test bias has not been able to identify a level of cultural bias sufficient enough to account for the disproportionate representation of ethnic groups in special education. This does not, however, suggest that the white-black test score gap is genetic. These test scores do, however, give a clear indication of the consistent disparities in the quantity and quality of educational resources available to African American students. Standardized tests may provide an accurate estimate of current individual aptitude, but they also provide researchers with an unbiased record of the effect of unequal educational opportunities, accurately reflecting the impact of economic and educational disadvantages. Side note, literature on test bias is more than 20 years old, and therefore it would be premature to rule out test bias as a source of minority disproportionality in special education. So we need more current research and resources about this. Now let's talk about poverty. Economic disadvantage is another factor that contributes to special education disproportionality among students of color. Socioeconomic status and geographical location has been associated with student educational achievement. A number of demographic factors such as housing stability, home environment, healthcare, and geographical location have been shown to be associated with student educational achievement or early cognitive development. However, to prove the link between poverty and disproportionality, there would need to be evidence that shows that economic disadvantage increases the risk of special types of learning and behavior problems as defined by the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act as a disability. Therefore, showing that poverty affects academic achievement does not prove a case for poverty as a cause for minority disproportionality or racial disparities in special education. But there is a side note. Students who are economically disadvantaged are also more likely to attend schools with reduced educational resources and fewer opportunities for quality instruction. Inequity in general education. Educational research has consistently found that students' achievement is highly affected by their opportunity to learn. Therefore, we can expect that students with limited educational opportunities are referred for special education services more often. An investigation into the proportion of culturally compatible teachers found that as the percentage of African American teachers increased, overrepresentation of African American students decreased. But in areas where the teaching force was 60% or more white, eligibility for special education rose for African American students. So, in essence, we need more teachers of color who can culturally relate to children of color. There has also been extensive documentation of the effect of inequity in the quality and quantity of educational resources. These resource disparities have roots in segregation and inequitable school funding. Quality teaching in high poverty areas may also be limited because of recruiting difficulty in geographic areas perceived to be challenging or less desirable. These inequities affect the education opportunity and achievement of children from low socioeconomic status, thus increasing the risk for special education referral. And basically, we just need better teachers to go work in the poverty areas or areas that are considered areas that people wouldn't want to work in. Other factors such as quality of curriculum, instruction, resources, or teacher training and their effect on disproportionality have not been directly studied at this time. Issues of behavior management, and this is the area that I'm most concerned with. Research has found that teachers refer minority children more often than non-minority children for special education evaluation, and that these referrals are more often for behavioral rather than academic issues. Studies have found that general education teachers are more likely to describe African American students as difficult to teach, and therefore they are more likely to be referred to special education. That is why I believe that there has to be more teaching, more workshops on cultural diversity. You got to get to know the culture of the students. This biased attitude by some teachers can be explained as the possible misinterpretation of culturally based behaviors or stereotypes of the African American student, especially male students. Cultural differences. Available data has pointed to systemic responses such as educators who may mistake cultural differences for cognitive or behavioral disabilities as a possible cause of the overrepresentation in more restrictive educational environments and underrepresentation in less restrictive settings of students of color, especially African Americans. Noteworthy is a 1968 critique of the field of special education, which identified the origin of disproportionate representation of some groups as having deep-set roots in discrimination and oppression. These are issues that have plagued race relations in our country throughout our history. Although we have come a long way as a nation from the civil rights movement of the 60s, I ask you, do children of color still suffer from discrimination in our educational systems in 2013, 2014? Interventions. Although there is no single cause to explain ethnic disproportionality in special education, survey data collected in the 1980s by the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights showed that distribution of disproportionality was consistent over time, causing a shift in research and a refocus on the forces that form and sustain disproportionate representation. In 1997, provisions concerning disproportionality were included in the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And in 2004, there was an expansion of provisions in the reauthorization of IDEA. These policy changes put pressure on states to monitor disproportionality, as well as requiring that there be a review of policies, practices, and procedures when there is evidence of disproportionate representation. Other mediation includes early intervention programs for infants and toddlers that identify and provide support for children who are struggling to learn. That is why preschool is so important. As a leader within my school, my goal is to significantly improve educational outcomes of students from historically underserved groups. It is my responsibility to not only monitor disproportionate representation in my school, but accurately identify the causes of the disparity. If we look at several possible causes of ethnic disparities, but we also know that there is no one single cause and that disproportionality can be multi-determined. From early intervention to systemic failures to institutional inequity, effective interventions will require a willingness by administration and staff to openly discuss and address issues of race, ethnicity, gender, class, culture, and language. And I understand that this is a tough subject for some to openly talk about. That's why there needs to be methods used to address inequity that have in place procedures that will ensure that the viewpoints of all involved is heard and respected. Some factors that should be addressed in order to begin to close the disparity gap are school structure and student-teacher connectedness, cultural competence, that's the workshops that we need to all be taking, relationships, that's student, teacher, and family, quantity and quality of student support to address learning barriers, quality of the academic and social emotional curricular instruction, and relationship between the school and the community members of color. Thank you for watching my presentation.